Well, I should say that it's taken me the better part of the last 4 years to recover from a health standpoint from the 1 year I lived here. I have lost 40 pounds over the last 2 years, which brings me back to my starting weight when I moved here. So in 1 week of being here in San Antonio, I think I've probably undone the last 4 years of slow but steady work. I don't regret it. But this week has been just wonderful. It's always a good week when you get to spend your time each evening sharing the Word of God, talking about God, enjoying the company of other believers, and just enjoying meals with brethren and brothers and sisters. There's no better way to spend the time. And then on top of that, with a church family that means so much to Jessica and I personally, it's been a wonderful week. I'm thankful to the elders for the invitation and for your hospitality, not only when we lived here, but even in the time since we've left, continuing to be friends. You guys have meant so much to us. And, after I left here and then COVID hit, there was a lot of second guessing about decisions made, and I've learned that you can't live in the past, but I did worry. I hope I didn't do something to this church and leave them in a bad position, especially when COVID broke out, and that was a rough year for everyone. Elderships across the country were in no-win positions, and I don't know how churches without elders managed to get through it. And I'm just thrilled to see that over the last couple of years, you've had a family like the Clevelands move here. They're just a wonderful family, aren't they? I'm glad I've got to know them, and I'm glad to see that the work he's done, the way they fit in with this congregation, the way you guys have continued to thrive, and I see so many of the same people here from 4 years ago. It's an answer to prayers to just see how you guys have been in such good shape, strong leadership, good preaching, good fellowship, and that's a good formula for congregation. So it's our last night, and we're going to be in John chapter 21. We're going to look at the last conversation here, and chronologically it does come at the end. This is the last one here in John's Gospel. And it's the conversation with Peter. Oh, and before we get into the text, I will also mention that if you are passing through Fresno, which is the most anyone ever does, it's a good town to pass through, just stop for a little bit and see us. We already told the Mitchells we have space for an RV to park there and for campers, so come and see us if you're anywhere near Central California. So in John's Gospel, we get this conversation at the end between the resurrected Jesus and Peter. And there's a lot that's going on after Jesus' death. At the beginning of this chapter, in chapter 21, Simon says in verse 3 that he says to the rest of the disciples and the apostles, I'm going fishing. And that's not like when I say I'm going fishing, because I never say that. But when I do, it's a rare thing. I'm going to relax. I'm going to catch fish. It's a hobby. Maybe I'll catch dinner, because I don't understand catch and release. If I get something which is rare, I'm going to keep it and eat it. But it's not a hobby. Peter says, I don't know what to do. I'm a fisherman. I'm going to go back to fishing. That's what it looks like to me. Like Peter is just unsure of where to go at this point, because Jesus has died, but yes, he's been resurrected, but Peter also said some things and did some things that weren't really apostle-like over the last couple of weeks, and denied his association with Jesus on multiple occasions and in very public ways. And I suspect that's what's going through his mind when he says, I'm going to go fishing. And then Jesus appears to him in this chapter. Now, let me just read the conversation. Let me read some of the highlights, and then we're going to go through this a couple of different times and notice some details. The first of which, I think you guys are really going to like this. We're going to talk about the Greek here. And I'll make it very clear, if it's not abundantly clear from the slide, from the title there, I am not a Greek expert. Don't look at me as an authority on the Greek language. I'm very much an amateur. But there's a lot going on here, and there's much that's been said about some of the words here. And we'll first address that, and then we'll break down. So read along with me. John chapter 21, beginning in verse 4. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, Children, have you any food? And they answered him, No. He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it because of the multitude of fish. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have just caught." Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" So he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my sheep." Then he said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." Now, I'm going to choose to focus on the conversation up to this point, although I do love, and there is a good point in the last couple verses, that Peter turning around, seeing the disciple whom Jesus loved, which most assume to be John, the author of this gospel, and says, "Lord," and says to him in verse 21, "Lord, what about this man?" And Jesus says, if I will that he reigns till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. There's a good point to be made there about just worry about yourself. But we'll save that for another time. Let's just focus on the conversation in verses 15 through 19 and the direct context in what's going on there. Now, when we come to the Greek that's here in this text, you've probably heard, I assume many of you have heard this discussion about the difference between agape and phileo and how they're used in this conversation. And I will admit that English is not a particularly exciting language. Not a very specific language. It's a language not of rules, but of just do what feels right. And then they made rules that are very inconsistently applied. Spanish makes a lot more sense to me, even though I'm a native English speaker. By comparison, the Koine Greek is a bit more specific than English. We do use words with varied meanings, like love. I would say I love my wife. I also would say I love pizza. It's one word that describes my feelings towards two very different things. So it's not the most incredible language that's ever been invented. It's just the most popular one at the moment. But Greek is a bit different, and we are right to point out some of the differences between English and Greek as we go through the Bible. And I hope you're not going to misunderstand me as we go through this study. So again, a couple things to be clear. For one, I am not a Greek expert. But for two, please don't understand that I'm saying you don't ever have to look in the Greek, because the point I want to make is that there is enough information in the English language, in the translation that you have in your hands, to get the meaning out of this text, to understand the message without having to go into Greek. But I am not suggesting that a study of Greek is never beneficial. I do think there are a lot of people that took maybe a semester of college Greek or took an online class on Greek and think they can retranslate the Bible from the pulpit, and I think they maybe cause more problems than they fix by doing that. But in the hands of someone who is knowledgeable, a study of the Greek or the Hebrew in the Old Testament can be revealing, can bring out some details of the text that might otherwise go unnoticed, but for the most part, I think you and I are best to just stick with the English version. I'm no expert in Greek. I'm barely even an expert on English. And I think we can trust the translation we have in our hands for the most part. That's a whole nother study in and of itself. Which translations do you study? Which ones are reliable? But when we look at the words agape and phileo, usually it's explained this way, that phileo is that brotherly love. It's when you love something or like something that is close to you or something that is likable. So we get the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, because it's got the same root word in there from phileo. It's more of a selfish kind of love. I love the things that I like, the things that are common to me, the things that I prefer. I love those things. But agape is usually presented as the selfless, higher form of love, like Jesus for mankind. Even though we were hostile towards him, we were his enemies, he loved us, not because we were so good to him or because we are just so close with him. He loved us because he regarded us as more important than himself. Philippians 2 that we read last night. And there is some nuance in the difference there, but let me just read a couple definitions I looked up from the New Testament Greek lexicon. Agape, of persons, to welcome, to entertain, to be fond of, to love dearly, affection. For phileo, it says to love, to approve of, to life or affection, befriend, to show signs of love, or as a secondary definition, kiss. Do you really see a great divide between those two concepts in the way they're defined? And when we look at the way these words are used in Scripture, and so this is what people will like to do, is when you look at the text here, Jesus asks him, do you agape? And Peter says, yes, I phileo. And so the idea is that Jesus is saying, do you agape, like the higher selfless form of love? And Peter says, no, I can only phileo. And by the end, the third time, Jesus says, do you phileo? And Peter says, you know I do. As if Jesus is saying, okay, I'm trying to get you to be up here with agape, but I'll come down and meet you at phileo. And is that really what's going on there? Is that really the main point of what we're supposed to see in this text? Let's just notice a few examples in how this word is used. Go to John chapter 3 and verse 35. I'll suggest to you, as limited as my knowledge in the Greek is, but I'll suggest to you by simply looking at how these words are used that they are perhaps more overlapping and interchangeable than we might have assumed. John chapter 3 and verse 35, the Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. I'll give you two guesses because there's only two options here. This is agape. The Father loves agape, the Son. Now, when we jump over a page to chapter 5, John chapter 5, and I want you to notice verse 20. It says, for the Father loves the Son. That is phileo. So what kind of word, which word describes the love that the Father has for the Son? Agape or phileo? The answer is both. They seem to be somewhat interchangeable. And we see the same effect where in John chapter 21 and verse 20 that we just read, when Peter, seeing the disciple whom Jesus loved, agape, well, back in chapter 20 and verse 2, it's the same expression, the disciple whom Jesus loved, phileo. So, and this is just a couple of examples right here in John. I wanted to stick close to John just to show you the way these two words, they're very interchangeable in how they're used in the Bible. And for that matter, when we talk about agape, the definitions I looked up don't really bear out that concept of being a higher and more selfless form of love. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 10, it talks about Demas. And we know Demas abandoned Paul, and it says because he loved this present world. And that is the word agape. So what does it mean that he loved the present world? That he put the world ahead of himself in a selfless way? Or does it just mean he loves the wrong things? So agape is used in all these examples here. John chapter 3 talks about loving the darkness instead of loving the light. But it's that word agape. We shouldn't love the dark. And if we love the dark, you'd think it would be phileo, that more selfish love, the way we've often thought of it. But no, it's the word agape. So I just wanted to point out that maybe what's going on here, the answer isn't so much in the Greek, but there's plenty of evidence right there on the page. So why does it go back and forth between agape and phileo? I don't really have a great answer, but sometimes when you're writing, you just start using the same word over and over and over again and say, I need to get the thesaurus out because it sounds a little too repetitive. And you can think of any kind of words out there. I hear my kids in the back of the car as we drive past a pasture of cows and say, it stinks. It smells right now. It reeks. Roll up the window. All different words that essentially mean the same thing, but it's just varying the words so it doesn't sound repetitious. I think that might be all that's going on here. And for that matter, when we look at what Jesus says in verse 15, feed my lambs, but then in verse 16, tend my sheep. Feed and tend are different. Sheep and lambs are different in the Greek. But I've never heard anyone preach a sermon where they break down the significance of lamb versus sheep. So all throughout this text, we've got synonyms that are just different words that essentially mean the same thing. And I don't think we're meant to analyze and dissect why those words are different. We're just meant to look at what is the message. So with our remaining time, we want to talk about what is the significance. If we're not supposed to go into the Greek and find some hidden meaning there, what is the message right there in English? Well, let's look at the context. We see the setting. There's several details that I want to draw your attention to as we go through them. The first of which is what's happened with Peter before this meeting. What name does Jesus call Peter in this conversation? Not Peter. Verse 15, Simon, son of Jonah. What does the name Peter mean? Rock. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. But there were a couple of times where Peter was not very rock-like. And in those times, Jesus would call him Simon, his given name, or birth name, if you will. Go over to Luke chapter, I can't even read that. It's 22. I was going to say 21. Luke chapter 22. I just want to I want to stick in John as much as I can, but I can't help myself because the way it's worded in Luke 22 is so helpful in understanding what's going on here at the end of John's gospel. Another very important conversation, and this might have been the last conversation Jesus had with Peter until this one here, at least in the biblical record. We know he's appeared to Peter a couple of times. It doesn't tell us exactly what was said in those conversations, but this is the last conversation before he died that we read about. Luke chapter 22, we know that Peter was all boasting. Someone's going to deny me. And Peter said, they all will. Not me. You guys are going to abandon me. They all will run away, but I never will, Jesus. So in Luke chapter 22, we pick up the text in verse 31. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, not Peter, and it's Simon twice. Indeed, Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. This is kind of reminiscent to me of Job. When Satan asks for permission, he can't act on his own. He acts within the bounds that God allows him. He acts within the parameters that God sets and defines. But let me take Job's possessions. He does that. Let me take away his health. Okay, don't take away his life, but you can affect his health now. And now with Peter, or Simon in this case, he's demanding to sift him like wheat. That's, you ever seen a sifter? It's that thing that just like grinds up and smashes through the wheat to separate parts of it, or you do it with flour or things like that. I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time in the kitchen. I spend a lot of time in other people's kitchens. But I understand the image here. He wants to chew you up, tear you to pieces. Satan wants to do some harm to you. And this is going to be very similar to the previous couple lessons. With the blind man, Jesus stepped back and allowed him to suffer. When it came to Mary and Martha, he could have been there and prevented Lazarus from dying, but he let it happen for a purpose, and he allowed them to suffer and experience some pretty heavy grief and sorrow. But it was for a purpose, that he might be glorified. And again, we see with Peter that Jesus is going to pray for him. And how powerful is that? Peter, I'm going to pray for you. But my prayer is that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. Peter, my prayer isn't that this would never happen to you, that Satan won't sift you like wheat. I'm going to let this happen. And my prayer is not for the avoidance of this heartache, but for your recovery after your mistakes. And that's important too. Again, as we reflect on the conversation in John chapter 21, Peter is fishing. I suspect that's because he feels like I burned that bridge. I had a chance and I was boasting, and you just see in the next couple verses here in Luke 22, but he said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And he says to him, I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny me 3 times that you know me. And in Matthew 26, verse 33, he says it even more strongly, I will never deny you. But he gives them these 3 penetrating statements. You will deny me this very evening before the morning dawns. And you're not going to do it just once or twice. You're going to do it 3 times. But Peter, my prayer is that after this, you will return to me and strengthen your brethren. Yes, Peter, you're going to mess up pretty badly. But that doesn't mean I'm through with you. That doesn't mean that you are no longer useful to me. In fact, I need you to come back, and I need you to strengthen your brethren, because they're all going to be struggling after my death. I'm going to need you, Peter. And he would be very rock-like in Acts chapter 2. In Acts when he preaching the gospel for the first time. In Acts chapter 3, when he goes to the temple and heals the lame man and begins to preach there, and then he's arrested. And in the next couple chapters, he and the other disciples are threatened by death if they don't stop preaching in his name. And they say, well, if you think it's right for us to ignore the voice of God and listen to the voice of men, well, that's your call, but we're going to choose to listen to God. Do your worst. He gets arrested in chapter 8, and James had just been beheaded, and they're gathered together praying for Peter. James had just been beheaded. Do they really expect him to be set free from prison? And he is. An angel comes and springs him from prison. And so he is going to experience some very difficult things, but he's going to be strong through it all. He's going to come back from this and strengthen his brethren. Anyone here ever make a mistake that you regret? Anyone here ever deny your faith and deny your association with Jesus, whether in word or by action? Anyone ever done it multiple times? You ever made the same exact mistake twice and feel like you're a dummy? I just can't figure it out. What would God want anything to do with someone like me? I can't even get my life together. Listen to what he says to Peter here. You're going to deny me this very night 3 different times, but Peter, I want you to pick yourself up, come back to me, get back to work and strengthen your brethren. I'm still going to need you. So I think that's clue number 1, the fact that he calls him Simon, not Peter. That's a callback to their last conversation before his death. Simon, Simon, Satan wants to sift you like wheat, and you're going to mess up, but I need you to come back. And then when we look at the denial itself, in John chapter 18, let's go back to John's gospel and notice a couple details from the actual denial. So John chapter 18, beginning in verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now, that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? And he said, I am not. Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Remember how I keep focusing in on the details? I'll admit that sometimes I might be looking for something that's not there, but I just have to ask why. Why did it matter that Jesus had a fire of coals on the shore of the water when they were fishing in chapter 21? Why does that detail matter? Why does that detail matter that on the night which he betrayed Jesus, he's warming himself around a fire of coals? Could there just be some similarity, some reminder? It's the same kind of environment. The conversation in John chapter 21 is around a fire of coals, just like Peter when he was denying Jesus. Could be a stretch. I just wonder why those two little details are mentioned in these 2 points. And we notice that Peter is following from a distance. Oh, I'm going to step on some toes with this one, myself included. Does that sound like the way some Christians behave today? I'm going to follow Jesus, but at a distance. It's easy to be a Christian when you're in this building with other believers. But when you go out into the world, when you go into a workplace where there are people that are not just indifferent, but hostile, antagonistic to your faith, I'll step back a little bit into the shadows, just like Peter did. And what we see in the gospel accounts, when you look at other gospel accounts too, Mark's especially, that every time this girl, and I can imagine he's getting so annoyed, quiet, leave me alone, I don't know him. Every time she says, but aren't you one of him? I know you're one of him. Every time he steps back even further to the outer court. He keeps, when the pressure's on, he backs further away from Jesus. And it's sad to say we do the same things ourselves. Walk away from my faith, diminish my faith, go into the shadows, distance myself from Jesus. And that's what Peter is doing in this account at the denials. And so I put that reference there in Mark chapter 14 for you that mentions specifically when he was recognized, he continued to back away from Jesus. And then when he denies him that third time, let's read a little bit further. There in John chapter 18, let's pick up in verse 18. Verse 19 is where we left off. Sorry, John chapter 18, verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine, and Jesus said, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always met, and in secret I have said nothing. So Jesus is giving his defense, and then we come to verse 25. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, You are not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Oh yeah, that's come back to bite him. Tried to cut off this guy's head and only nicked his ear, and Jesus healed him. How did that not convince everyone that came to arrest him, by the way? I don't know. But then Peter denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Now, John's gospel lets Peter off the hook, in my opinion. But when you look at Luke chapter 22, let's go back to Luke chapter 22 one more time. Luke tells us a little bit more of Peter's reaction here. In Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 50. Actually, let's go to verse 60. Luke 22, verse 60. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you are saying. Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. That had to hurt. I don't know how far away he was, but it just shows to me that Jesus knew everything that was happening in this moment. Nothing about that night, nothing about the cross was a surprise to Jesus. And he knew exactly in this moment, I don't think he could even hear what's going on with Peter, but he turns and looks at him, and I wonder what that face was like, and I wonder how Peter responded. But Jesus looks at him, and Peter remembered the word that before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. This is the ugly cry. He knows he messed up. And Luke tells us how much he was feeling it in that moment. This was a major failure. So when we look at this conversation, I think we see the details, and that's really all we need to know. There could be some detail, information, nuance in the Greek that would be helpful. Sure. But is there enough on the pages of the English text to understand the point here? Do you love me more than these? Why does he ask that question? More than who? The other disciples, the other apostles. In Matthew 26, I referenced this one earlier, but I wanted to save it for right now. Matthew 26 and verse 33. Peter answered and said to him, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. I love you more than these. I'm more devout than the others. They'll walk away from you. They'll quit, but I never will. So the question itself is a callback to, well, Peter, what do you think? You made a pretty big boast. You said you'd never. You said the others would and you wouldn't. You went with them. You walked away. You denied me. So what do you think? Now, do you still say the same thing, Peter? Do you still love me more than the others? So we look and see meaning in the very form of the question itself. And then the repetition of the questions. I'll point out to you again in John chapter 21 that the third time that he asked him, it says in verse 17, Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? One question for each denial. There's meaning in the repetition of the question. So really what we're doing here, and then this final statement in verse 18, most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you did whatever you wanted, but not so when you're older. Someone's going to carry you where you do not wish to go. And it says he said this, signifying by what death he would glorify God. Peter, you proclaimed that you were going to follow me to death, be arrested with me, and lay down your life. And then you backed off from that. But Peter, this is your second chance. This is your opportunity to come back and do again. And you are going to lay down your life for me, just not in the way you thought. Just not the way you expected. Going out in a blaze of glory with your sword swinging, ready to take people with you and die as a martyr. You're going to live a bit more humbly than that. And your death is not going to come the way you thought it would, fighting. But this is the answer to that prayer in Luke chapter 22. Peter, I pray that your faith won't be destroyed, that you won't stumble, that after this you'll come back to me and you'll strengthen your brethren. And here he's saying, Peter, you messed up, but here's your second chance. And that's such a powerful lesson, and it teaches us so much about the love and patience of Jesus. How many stories in the Bible are about people making mistakes? Genesis chapter 12 is so amazing because Abraham is given this awesome covenant. Abraham, drop everything you know, go to a strange land, leave your family behind. And he does it, and God gives him this covenant. I'll bless you and make you great and give you this land, and in you all families of the earth will be blessed. I'll bless you to be a blessing to others. What's the next story in Genesis 12? He decides to go to Egypt. God didn't tell him to do that. And then he digs himself into a little bit of a hole. That's my sister, not my wife. Pharaoh took her. Now what do I do? God had to come bail him out. And if you're in the position of God, you're thinking, Abraham, this covenant thing isn't really working out. You're not the right stuff. I'm going to find someone who will listen to me better. No. He renews the covenant with Abraham. Abraham did some amazing things. He did some pretty stupid things sometimes too. And that's the story of everyone in the Bible except Jesus. And that's our story too. I've denied Jesus. I've disobeyed Jesus. And sometimes I've done it in this exact same way so many times that I lose confidence in myself, and maybe that's a good thing, because my salvation is in His hands. It requires my faith, it requires my participation and my obedience, but salvation is of Jesus, not my works, and that's an amazing truth. If you are here this night and you've made some mistakes, you have not been what you know you ought to be, you've not been a rock. You've been Simon, not Peter. This is your opportunity. As Jesus showed us in this conversation, He'll have the same conversation with you. Pick yourself up, repent, come back to me, and get back to work strengthening your brethren. And if that's your story tonight, we'd love to pray with you, encourage you, answer any questions you have, study with you, whatever you need, even if it means washing your sins away in baptism, calling on His name, and being committed to Him for the rest of your life. Won't you come forward now as we stand and sing?